Hi everyone, in this video of Accelerated Chess Dragon, we're going to be looking at a game played between Magnus Carlsen and Viswanathan. This was played in the 2012 Bilbao Masters Tournament in Bilbao, Spain, and without further ado, let's look at this game. So Magnus plays e4 and c5 by Anand, knight f3, d6, and now bishop to b5 check. And why does Magnus Carlsen play bishop b5 check on the third move? Well, first of all, this is actually the Rossolimo variation of the Sicilian, and it's also because Magnus wants to prevent Anand from playing the Sicilian Najdorf. So Anand plays bishop d7, and we have a trade of bishops, c4, and now knight f6. So we get the Moscow variation of the Sicilian defense. Usually when the knight develops out to f6 on the third move, it's kind of transposed to that. And it turns out that actually a few rounds earlier, Anand had played the move knight c6 against Fabiano Caruana, but it didn't turn out very well for him. In fact, that game actually ended in a draw. So instead, Anand decides to play knight f6, and he wants to get a positive result against Carlsen. Carlsen plays knight c3, and now g6, so getting ready to fianchetto the bishop, and it will be very active on that long diagonal. d4, c takes d4, knight takes d4, bishop g7, and now f3. White's main idea is to play the Maroczy bind with light-squared bishops already traded off. And because White's pawns are all on light squares, this is a very good position for White, and it's definitely advantageous for White. So here, queen c7 by Black, b3, and now queen a5. What Anand is trying to do is try to strike on the queen side of the board. And here, Carlsen decides to play bishop b2, which doesn't break the pin immediately by playing bishop to d2, which is quite interesting. Why didn't Carlsen just go bishop to d2? Because b3 was mainly played with the idea of going bishop to b2, and playing bishop to d2 makes that move look completely silly, and that's why bishop b2 was played. Knight c6 was played by Anand, and here Carlsen just castles. And so does Anand, because Anand could try pinning the knight on d4, but after queen c5, for instance, Carlsen could just defend with knight a4. Essentially what happens is that the queen gets kicked away from pinning the knight when the knight goes to a4. So it really doesn't favor Black in a case like that, so that's why Anand did not want to go for queen c5. Instead, he castles and knight ce2 by Carlsen. So after knight ce2, we have the move rook fd8. And here the move bishop c3 was played by Carlsen. And this move is actually considered to be slightly inaccurate, as it allows Black to break the position open later on with d5. Now you might be asking me, how in the world does Black play d5 when it's guarded at least 2 times? And it's guarded by pawns. It would have actually been better to go king h1 and break the pin towards your knight on d4 to the king on g1, but instead bishop c3. Carlsen wants to kick the queen back, and only now king h1. And here, this is what I meant when I said d5. d5 can now be played by Anand. And how does this work? Because now Carlsen is forced to play knight takes c6. Why doesn't he just take the pawn on d5 with something like e takes d5? Well, it turns out that actually Anand has a very nice tactical sequence that actually wins him quite some decent amount of material. Can you spot it? Okay, so the correct move is actually just to play knight takes d5, and Anand wins the pawn back, and in fact he actually kind of wins a bit of more material. After knight takes d5, if you play knight takes c6, then you're losing your bishop on c3. So you obviously don't want to allow that, as that would also allow discoveries towards your queen on d1. So c takes d5. Carlsen would have just taken the knight on d5, but now Anand can play rook takes d5. And essentially what's going to happen is that Anand is going to win his piece back, but not only that, he is also going to be up 1 pawn, assuming that Carlsen will not seek to get any counterplay. So Anand would definitely be favored in that case, and that's why Carlsen didn't want to go for e takes d5. Instead, after d5 was played, he just captured the knight on c6, and after b takes c6 was played by Anand, he went queen to e1. This is a strong, subtle move, and First of all, Carlsen gets out of the pin that this rook on d8 has towards the queen, but at the same time, he's also threatening this bishop a5 move, which could skewer the queen to the rook on d8. So, Anand plays the move rook d to c8. a5 would have been a lot better because it allows black to create counterplay on the queen side, and the idea is to go a5 and then a4 later on in the game. And it starts to weaken and chip away white's solid structure of the Maroczy bind. You notice that this structure is very intact. Well, with a4, Anand is trying to change that, and he's trying to make it a lot more weakened, essentially. So rook dc8 instead was played by Anand. Now, after rook dc8 was played, e5. So Carlsen goes straight for an attack, knight to e8, and now e6. And these are just very incredible moves. And Anand actually plays the move f takes e6. It would have actually been better to play the move f5 or f6, just to blunt the power of this bishop. And yes, white does get a pawn wedge on the e6 square, but if you think about the advantages that black gets, like a very active square for his knight on d6, and then maybe potential attacks later on, something like d4, c5, maybe black's position doesn't actually seem to be that bad. However, that was not played in the game. Anand just captured the pawn on e6, and now this creates a ton of more weaknesses around his camp. So knight f4. The problem about this position is that it's tough for Anand to actually defend the e6 pawn, because it's constantly going to be a target, and it's very hard to defend it constantly and also activating your pieces at the same time. So bishop c3, queen c3, and here Anand plays the move d4, kicking the queen back. The queen retreats to d2, and now we have c5. So Anand tries to cement the pawn on d4. However, there are two things that are wrong with that. First of all, you're not really worried about the threats that Carlsen has whenever he's going to have ideas of jumping into e6. And the second thing is that c5 doesn't really take care of any threats at all. Yes, it defends the d4 pawn, but you should be more worried about this e6 pawn. Perhaps a better idea could have been even playing e5 and defending the pawn this way, because this pawn is constantly going to be a target, and it's better to just perhaps save that one instead of trying to reinforce this pawn that way, because it is a lot weaker when it's on the e6 square. So rook a e1, knight g7. You see now how Anand has to tie down all of his pieces to try defending just the single pawn. g4. And this is an excellent move played by Magnus. And what white is trying to do is restrict the movement of the knight on g7, and here rook to c6. So Anand wants to, yet again, reinforce the e6 pawn. But that's completely unnecessary. You should just give the pawn back up, and you're not going to have any trouble. Because the more you defend the pawn, the less you're actually worrying about your own counter threats. And if Anand is going to continue defending the pawn with rook c6, the queen on b6, with this knight on g7, he's not even going to be thinking about all of the other counterplay that he can get. For instance, Anand could try to just go a5, a4, and strike this side. Maybe divert Carlsen's attention to the queen side, and then, then it's a good time to take care of this threat. However, Anand is just so focused on defending the pawn that the counterplay for him is coming secondary. So knight h3 is played now by Carlsen. Carlsen hopes to play the move queen to h6, and then knight to g5 and attack this h7 pawn. It's extremely weak, so it makes sense why Carlsen would do that. Here, the move knight e8 was played because what Anand wants to do is go back to f6 and try to defend that way. Because if the queen goes to h6, knight f6, and now knight g5, there's not really going to be an easy way of actually kicking this knight away from f6. And knight e8 was actually better than king to h8, because if you go king to h8, then there's queen h6, queen to d8, and now you go knight g5. Obviously, you're still threatening this h7 pawn, and if queen g8, then f4. What is the idea of f4? Well, you're actually trying to go rook f3, make a rook lift, and then this pawn is definitely a goner. So, that is the idea that Carlsen is trying to threaten. So, king h8 can't be played by Anand. So we have the move knight e8, and black wants to bring the knight over to f6 and defend the pawn. However, this leaves the e6 pawn very weak. Queen goes to h6, knight f6, and now knight g5. Okay, so now there's threats towards h7, d3, and does Carlsen care about the advancing pawn? No, he does not. He goes rook e5. His idea is to bring this other rook over to d1 and then take care of the threat in case the pawn gets too close. And his idea is that he also wants to include this rook on e5 in the attack towards black's king. King to h8 was played by Anand, trying to sidestep any of the ideas, and now rook to d1, targeting the d3 pawn. Anand goes queen to a6, since trying to defend the pawn with something like rook d6 would allow knight f7 check. And after this, you would just win the exchange as Carlsen. So the move queen a6 was played, but after a4, knowing that he cannot create any more threats on Carlsen's queen side, because it's very late now, Anand resigned the game. The idea is to just capture the d3 pawn, play f4, maybe include this rook on h3, and the attack starts. And basically, Carlsen has literally nothing to do that could actually defend that. Because after this is played, if you try rook to d8 to defend the pawn, you get knight f7. Same if rook d6. So you have to give up this pawn, and let's say you go king g8, you lose the pawn, and now if you say you want to play rook c8, for instance, just f4. And this pawn is not hanging because there's check on h7 and then queen f7 is mate. So let's say rook d6, you go rook h3. Simple idea, you just want to attack the h7 pawn. And at the moment, your threat is knight h7. So if you want to try getting more defenders here, then white can just take the pawn on h7 and it's no big deal. And if you try to capture the pawn on g4, the rook is hanging, and also there is no way to defend the position, since bringing the rook up to f7 would just allow the move knight f6, but also queen g6, and that's simply winning for white. So after the move a4 was played, Anand resigned the game, and a very brilliant victory to Magnus Carlsen. So I hope you all enjoyed the video, and if you have any suggestions or feedback for me, please let me know in the comment section, and stay tuned for more chess.